All right. Greetings, friends and comrades. Welcome to another episode of Emancipations podcast. I am your host, Daniel Tutt. I am extremely honored and pleased to welcome a new guest today to talk about a book that recently came out, which I just finished, called Genius After Psychoanalysis, Freud and Lacan, by Daniel Cho at Otterbein University. He teaches education. He's written a couple of books before this one on Marcuse's theory of pedagogy, which looks actually very interesting. And I think another book on psychoanalysis and education, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
So Daniel, it's nice to have another Daniel in the house. Yes. Well, there's many ways into this conversation. I suppose the first one would be the kind of compromised status of the theory of genius or the concept of genius. Can you tell us about why genius got tarnished? And well, I'm confessing my own bias because I do not like the way that people talk about genius. I will be honest. I think that people they either create a kind of physiological or overly biological account of genius, or it's highly reductive. They base it on like your aptitudes or how good at testing you are as a young child and some sort of inborn trait. Psychoanalysis gives us something extremely different than conventional theories of genius give us. We're going to get to that. But talk about the general status of genius, why you find it compromised, because I think you do confess that you're not necessarily like committed to it as a plausible sort of category. Is that correct?
I think that's one way to see it. Sure. Well, let me first of all say thank you, Daniel, for having me on the podcast. It's a great honor to be here to talk to you and for you generously to talk about the book. I really appreciate it. So yes, genius right now is basically a biological concept or a psychological concept as far as the world is concerned. And it strangely maps onto power relations, like you have more men geniuses than women. They tend to always be billionaires, they always tend to be in technology. So it's actually interesting because like the artistic genius is something that we don't really talk about anymore in our society. All of our geniuses are running rogue shadow government agencies now, or some kind of technology firm. But I guess one thing I would say about that is that philosophy itself is not really what do you call it, exonerated from that implication, because for philosophy, genius is some kind of extra paranormal inspiration. It is literally some kind of spirit that gives you an inspiration, so it's already there in philosophy, that this idea that you would be possessed by some kind of foreign spirit, some entity that we kind of can't capture. And we just simply have done now is simply try to locate that spirit into the neurons of our brain, and so, yeah, the figure of genius, I think, is totally compromised. It's something that that kind of genius I totally reject. It doesn't exist. But does it mean that we get rid of the category of genius altogether? That's so something that has been sort of, I guess, maybe just even in my training in graduate school. So I worked with a man named Doug Kellner, and he was a Marcuse scholar, and he was very, the dialectical method for him meant like you don't just throw babies out with bathwater. The process of negation through which something becomes sublated is really important. And so I kind of brought that sensibility to this concept of genius and what remains after genius, after we get rid of all of these other kinds of foreign contaminants, right? We get rid of the biology, we get rid of all of this other stuff does anything remain in genius at the end? And I think that my argument in the book is that yes, something very valuable still exists, and you might even say it's repressed by these other accounts of genius, probably because maybe there's something in it that's a little bit more disturbing than we would be willing to accept. So I think that to answer the question of do I reject genius, I think that account of genius I reject. But I'm hesitant to then throw out the category altogether. I think that concedes too much to the other side.
Thank you. Okay. So when you say philosophy is complicit with a commitment to genius, I certainly can see that, but I wanted to maybe probe that a bit more. Are you thinking here of Socrates' daimon, for example? Like for example?
I'm actually specifically thinking of Kant. And the third critique, in which he talks about genius as being some kind of spiritual inspiration to rewrite the rules of aesthetics. But I think that you find figures of this in other places. Certainly, I don't think in Socrates though, or in Plato. I don't think that's a figure of genius. There's a lot of other things going on. Yeah.
No, I didn't think so either. I was just curious. Okay,
yeah.
So you're making a reference directly to Kant's theory of kind of a spiritual inspiration for artists and aesthetes, so to speak.
Yes, yeah. So for Kant, it's very explicit. He calls it. Let me see if I can find the reference. I don't have the reference in front of me, but yeah, for Kant, it's explicitly genius. Whereas I think in Plato, it would only be genius by analogy.
Okay, that makes good sense to me, because part of my inspiration for reading your book was based on my own research into the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. I don't know if you've studied Nietzsche's comments on genius, but he says a lot actually about genius that is sort of historically and politically locatable within a particular trajectory of European society after the French Revolution. And Nietzsche believes that society after the French Revolution is eradicating the possibility of genius.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a motif that we find a lot on the right. Still to this day, the notion that something about egalitarian politics will harm art, will harm the possibility specifically of artistic genius. So it's kind of paradoxical. What you said is interesting, that today we don't talk about artistic genius, but I think that there was a kind of Enlightenment or late Enlightenment European thought that really saw the movements of socialism in particular as posing a danger to what makes European culture so vital. And for Nietzsche, one of the things that makes it so vital is the capacity for great, rare geniuses to emerge. Obviously, this is exemplified through the notion of the Overman itself, but it's also something that really shaped his mood and it really made him melancholic.
Mm-hmm.
To see a world in which there's no longer an appreciation for genius. So it creates a kind of resentment as well over the forces of the left. So that's a kind of a side point. I don't know if you've thought much about the political implications of that.
So I like that account of Nietzsche that you just gave right there, and I think you're also right to note that Nietzsche is not singular in having this kind of melancholic attachment to genius. That it's a sort of a prominent anxiety on people on the right, and I think that I guess I'm not as concerned about that. First of all, I don't think it's correct. Well, so there's many problems with this, right? So first of all, you would have to subscribe to this idea of genius as exceptionality. Then you would have to subscribe to this idea that leftist politics eradicates exceptionality, right? And then you would have to, like, there's many premises there you would have to agree to before you can kind of come to that conclusion. And I don't accept any of them, essentially. Now, as to the question of the political implications of genius, so in the third part of the book, I try to work out what might be considered a group psychology of genius. It's not something that comes easily, right? So there is a sense of achievement with this kind of formation. But so I do think that so on one side you have this kind of genius as rare exception, right? That we comes from all sorts of places. The other side of this, though, is all those self-help books that, like, genius of, we're all geniuses, we all have it within ourselves. And so, like, while you're trying to dodge one bullet, you're also trying to not end up saying, well, we're all geniuses. We just all have to activate these 10 effective habits and voila, we're all genius, right? Because in a sense, that also washes out what genius is, right? If we're all genius, then none of us are genius. So I think psychoanalysis is really trying to thread a needle here, right? At one point, it's trying to say, no, there's nothing exceptional about genius in terms of the materials, right? It's not, like in Plato, you've got bronze people, silver people, and gold people, right? And like psychoanalysis is saying, well, we're all the same metal, right? None of us are essentially different than another. At the same time, we all don't experience genius. It recognizes that too, right? That there's an achievement sense there. And how does that come about? Well, the figure of the drive becomes very important. And once you focus on this formation of the drive, you begin to wonder, well, is there some kind of collectivity that's possible? And I think that's where I do think that, you might say, if you were prone to nice little, fortune cookie sayings, you might be prone to say that all leftist politics requires some genius.
Right.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I mean, I've always thought, and we're going to get into psychoanalysis and the theoretical basis of how Freud upends our understanding of genius in a moment. But I've always been a little annoyed with some of these kind of fetishizations of genius as not necessarily relying on a biological model, but like, let's take Arthur Rimbaud, very famous French poet who is seen as this kind of like prophet of modernity, but he died in his like early 20s or something like that.
Okay.
Right. And he actually produced all of his greatest work maybe before he's 21, if I'm not mistaken. Like, he's extremely young. And so this idea of the genius as precocious, right, kind of like ex nihilo, like they just sort of emerge, has deeply bothered me. Not in some like Malcolm Gladwell way. Like, Malcolm Gladwell has that stupid idea of the TED Talk, which is, oh, well, geniuses are defined through hard work. And my sense of that is, yes, that is true. But the way that you're kind of instrumentalizing it for your neoliberal fantasy concept of the entrepreneur is itself also problematic. So it becomes, Daniel, like very difficult to sort of arrive at a proper theory of genius and how to sort of disentangle your theory with all of these different political dimensions. It's quite complicated. Before we talk about Freud, what do you make of like the Rimbaud example, out of curiosity? What do you make of the idea of the precocious artistic genius who just somehow, taps into something without doing the work? The preparation, the reading, in some cases, they don't even have training.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
Actually, I think there's a lot of problematic figures of genius, right? Like, so yeah, you've got one of them there, right? The young, precocious one Then there's the one who's like just like comes out of nowhere, is inspired, no training, like there's many of these, I would say, problematic figures of genius. And you're also right to contrast this with the sort of the bootstrap genius, right? Like, so the opposite, if you reject this idea that genius is just someone who's, and I would say here that this is not a figure of genius that's foreign to like Immanuel Kant, right? That is the Kantian genius, right? Something that you can't really account for, and so the youth of the person usually is a way to try to buttress this idea that it happened through inspiration and not through formal education or something like that, right? So that's where that youth comes into play, is to sort of augment that, that account of them being inspired. So certainly this is not a foreign concept to, and I think that when philosophy, was thinking about genius, they had these kind of things in mind, But if you reject that, then you seem to automatically have to accept this idea that genius comes through 10,000 hours of hard work, because those seem to be opposed, And so once again here, psychoanalysis is trying to thread a needle, right? Like,
Yeah.
No, I reject both of those. It's like the coffee or tea, no thank you, right? Like I don't want any of those.
There might even be a more pernicious account, like a third account, which would say, almost like, think about it, almost like pure market instrumentalism, which would say something like, well, genius can be bought, or
Yes,
something,
absolutely.
right? Which is like, who's that guy with the long gray beard, and he doesn't know how to play music, but he is like a muse to musicians.
Oh.
Do you know who I'm talking about? He's like all over the podcast world.
Oh,
I think
no.
it's Rick Rubin. May ring a bell to you.
I don't know this guy. Yeah.
He's like he's a music producer, and he's produced some of the best albums.
Oh, I think I do know this person.
Rubin, yeah.
He's
a good case study for you. He's a good case study because what I find interesting about this guy, and I've listened to his book on creativity, and it's very like Jungian, or even like David Lynch had this insight meditation kind of mumbo jumbo theory of creativity.
Yeah.
And I felt like there's a paradox there, because while from a kind of philosophical materialist standpoint, we can sort of criticize New Age philosophy as vulgar or reductive or kind of like empty or superficial.
Yeah.
But from the standpoint of creative productivity, there's a bit of a paradox insofar as like utilizing that model could still have like beneficial effects on the creative process itself. So that's one point. And the second point is that I fear that, there's a certain possibility in the future for people to basically create a kind of unthinking class inequality system in which people, especially with AI, no longer actually need to have a ground in any performance of their own creativity. They can just be infused with like all of the right tips to produce something. So all skill is gone.
Yeah.
I fear for that too. So I'm just trying to introduce people to the kind of vortex of this. It's very interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. Actually, so it's already instrumentalized. You can already right now go buy programs that will teach you how to be a genius. They exist already. Yeah, there are already gurus that will help unlock your genius. Actually, but to your point about producing some kind of market ready product as the measure of your genius. So one of the things I argue in the book is that actually genius is very unuseful. Where it manifests is in the productive in actualizing the non-use of an object, getting to what I even use in the book some examples that show how you can even take a very useful object like a toothbrush, and for a genius it becomes this kind of just object as object. something that's taken out of circulation. So I think that you're right you're right to point to the vortex between, on one hand, this instrumental, you make iPhones for the market, and on the other hand, this washed out, amorphous, purely performative genius that actually has no grounding in the real world. It's just sort of like a name tag you put on your badge or something like that. I'm a genius. And I think that one way to think about that is to think about objects, which is something psychoanalysis is extremely concerned about, and the usability of objects, right? Or the non-usability of objects, as it were. And that's something that psychoanalysis is extremely concerned about.
Yeah. So all right. So that's a little prefatory context for the category as a sort of social political category, and its complexity. Now let's turn to Freud. I'm not sure the best way in. I suppose one of the important points is the theory of sublimation, of course, but also Leonardo da Vinci's account of genius as Freud analyzes it in his study of Leonardo, which you point out importantly is a study of the pivot that Leonardo makes from art to science. And that pivot's crucial. Why did Freud focus on that? And can you kind of elaborate Freud's analysis of Leonardo and his genius?
So the question of why he focuses on that, I guess that's up for speculation. But I can tell you generally. So this book, Leonardo da Vinci and the Memory of His Childhood, is Freud's attempt to try to understand why was Leonardo a genius. At least that's the way I read it. It's actually, it's usually typically people read it as a stereotypical psychobiography, that psychoanalysis can produce. And actually, what it's most famous for is Freud's misinterpretation of a word. He thinks it means vulture, nubio, but it actually turns out to means kite. So it actually blows up a whole portion of his argument. But he's really fascinated with this idea that Leonardo says that, your love for something depends on how much you know that something. And so the more you learn about it, the more your love is worthy of that object. And if you have very little knowledge about that object, then your love is worth very little. And so Leonardo presumably is trying to explain why he cares about science so much, right? So just to paint beautiful objects is not enough for Leonardo. He needs to understand how light works, how color works, right? He needs to understand how beauty works for him to really say he has an appreciation for something. And then on the other hand, you have this strange feature of Leonardo's biography, which is he always abandons his artwork, right? And I think even to this day, he's kind of known for this, and a very famous example of this would just be Mona Lisa. It's considered an unfinished, at least as far as Leonardo is considered, it's unfinished. And so you have these kind of two things going on in Leonardo, and Freud wants to understand maybe these are linked. Maybe the inability to finish something is linked to this desire to want to found your love for something on knowledge. And so he goes into it trying to understand that connection. Now, it's very important. This is something Freud points out, is that all of Leonardo's friends wanted him to be producing more artwork so that he could sell them on the market and become rich. And instead, he just spends his time doing these kinds of strange scientific studies. And it's that straying away from the goal of making money that becomes of extreme interest for Freud. He begins to think that therein lies Leonardo's genius, this movement away, right? And so then what he wants to do is he wants to understand this in terms of what it tells us about the drive that all human beings have. Human beings are creatures of drive for Freud. And maybe understanding this exceptional case will help us understand something about all of us. And so what what that brings us to is this theory of sublimation that he starts to elaborate in this book. And it's probably the clearest elaboration we have, because he never, it's sublimation is a concept that comes up over and over again in Freud, but he never actually wrote anything about it explicitly. And that's kind of unusual for Freud. Almost every concept that he talks about in his psychoanalytic corpus, he has a text dedicated to it. He's got a text on fetishism, on fantasy, he's got on masochism, but he doesn't have anything on sublimation. So it kind of remains kind of a dark spot in what we know about Freud. And what that has led to are all these misinterpretations of what sublimation is. And I think so if I'm also trying to intervene in the discourse on genius in this book, I'm also trying to intervene in the discourse on sublimation, which I feel like has been misunderstanding the concept.
Amazing. Yeah. So I want to invite you to say something more about sublimation. I myself have studied and been fascinated with sublimation because, of course, the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan has a formula for the kind of core function of sublimation, which is the elevation of an object to the dignity of a thing. And one of the examples that he gives that I think is illustrative here is he says, well, you could think about sublimation in the field of art is if you go to a dive bar and you get back when you could smoke in dive bars, you may be old enough to remember that.
Yeah.
They used to have matchbooks that were for the bar, and they had the little logo of the bar on them. And some of my friends used to collect them. And well, that object of the matchbook would be just an ordinary object if it was sitting on a coffee table in your house after you came home from the bar. But Lacan says, but if you raise that object and you put it on the wall as if it is a piece of art, you've elevated it to a dignity of a thing.
Yeah.
I always felt like that makes a lot of sense, right? It's interesting, right? And then, of course, his other example of this, of course, is the way that women were dealt with in feudal times as elevated as ladies that necessitated a certain elevation and dignity and so on, right? For which we know through the romances of courtly love.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea is Lacan's idea. Perhaps, Daniel, you could tell us Freud's idea. I mean, we know from Civilization and Its Discontents, he talks about how in capitalist society, work has to be sublimated. And so he kind of touches on it a lot, but maybe you could tell us sort of, what does he say more substantively about it?
Yeah, so thank you for asking that question. So Freud's formula for sublimation is that it aims for some kind of satisfaction that's not sexual. That's the gist of what he says. And what people take that to mean is that you've got this guy, he's very horny, and he doesn't have sex. Instead, he goes paints a painting. He's sublimated his sexual desire into, and people, what's really, it's going to your courtly love example from Lacan. You can see how this misinterpretation of Freud easily maps onto, right? Like, you want to have sex with this lady, so you can't, so you engage in poetry and wooing, and it develops this, and neither Freud or Lacan are talking about that. That's nothing to do with anything. And what strikes me about this way of thinking about sublimation as like just turning your sex drive into science and baseball and collecting books or whatever, is that it's a totally unpsychoanalytic definition of sexuality. So it amazes me that psychoanalytic theorists themselves propagate this idea of sublimation uncritically. Psychoanalytic theorists themselves should be the first people who tell you that is not what psychoanalysis means when they talk about sexuality, right? It's not about sex. It's also, and so where we start to understand Freud is when we start to really apply seriously that when he talks about sexual aims and non-sexual aims, we we take him at his word that he means these terms in psychoanalytic ways. And what that means is that what that quickly brings you to is this idea of satisfaction and non-satisfaction. So in Freud, the drive always aims for satisfaction, a lowering of tension, a release of tension. And that release of tension produces what he calls sexual pleasure. Okay. And then what non-sexual pleasure, what non-sexual displeasure is the increasing of tension, non-release, okay, and innervation, not getting rid of stuff. And so what that means is that what psychoanalysis is what Freud is talking about when he talks about sublimation is he's talking about something that was once pleasure seeking now becomes unpleasure seeking, right? And that takes you to a radical dimension of psychoanalysis, because as Lacan has famously said, I'm not fucking you right now, but in speaking, I can have the same pleasure, right? Meaning that in psychoanalysis, pleasure is something that manifests in all sorts of things, not just sex. And so for Freud, what he's talking to us about then is that these activities that were once pleasurable for Leonardo, for example, they become unpleasurable. So why is he doing all of this science? Not for pleasure. He's doing them for unpleasure. And in that unpleasure, he finds pleasure. And that's what makes him a genius. That's what makes it so exceptional. That's what makes it different than all of us. Like, for me, I take pleasure in eating a cupcake or, buying a book or, like going for a run. But what does it mean to aim for those things, not for the sexual pleasure they give you, but for something else? And that's actually how I read Lacan too. So in the second part of the book, I take up Lacan's theory of sublimation because I see it as a supplement to this Freudian notion. And what I see in Lacan is that our relationship to objects, or we see them as a means to our pleasure. Like the old cartoons when they would, someone's Wimpy is very hungry. So when he sees Popeye, he turns into a hamburger, like when we look at objects, we boil them all down to what pleasure they mean for us, what we can instrumentally get out of them. And what I think Lacan is saying is that we start to see objects not in terms of the pleasure they yield us, but precisely for their own ontology. And that's what I take him to mean as this thing that's not reducible to my use. And so what I see as important in that matchbox example is that the collector is taking that matchbox out of the sphere of circulation, out of the sphere of use values. What becomes important about that matchbox is not that it holds matches, but for its own objectness, its own thingliness. And the same thing can be true of courtly love. What the romancier loves about the woman that's being venerated in these poetry and all of this wooing is not eventually to build up the suspense so that they can go have sex with this lady, but because precisely they take this object, this woman, and they take it out of the circulation of sexual pleasure. And that, I think, is what I think is very important about sublimation, and maybe answer some of those questions we had earlier about the relationship between this kind of like capitalist version of a genius and things like that.
Well, it also reminds me of Antigone's obsession with the burial of her brother.
Yes.
As something that is prohibited by the law. So that you're immediately introduced to this question, I think that's quite interesting, of a kind of non-instrumentalized obsessional point that becomes the object of genius, which does not necessarily elicit pleasure through the genius's investment in achieving it. So one could think here, for example, of the pain, but other emotions as well, of writing. I know for myself that writing is not necessarily by any stretch a pleasurable activity. So I wonder how we might further define artistic engagement, whether that be like painting or writing, etc., etc. At what point does it become sublimatory? Might be a question. Is that hinged on or defined by the investment that I, as a writer, let's say, have with the object of what it is I'm writing? It's like, say, for example, I have a day job and I'm just writing like ad copy, but then I wake up in the morning and I write my novel. When I'm writing my novel, and it's like a totally different source of pleasure for me, which is both painful but also pleasurable, let's say. This is just an example. It's not real life. Am I sublimating then? But then in my day job, I'm not? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Just
no,
to
that's
make
a
it more
very good
concrete,
question.
out of curiosity.
That's a very good question. I think that I think the way I would answer that is it does depend on how. Okay, so sublimation is not willpower, right? So I think that so many of us, so I go to work. I have a very stultifying job. I'm just pulling a lever all day, or I'm just filling up cups all day, and none of it is pleasurable. But then I get to go home and have a beer and turn on the TV and watch some football, and all that tension that's built up throughout the day is now, like I love to ride my bike. So no matter how bad my day is, I just go on a little bike ride, and at the end of it, I'm smiling, I'm feeling good about myself. That's not sublimation, right? Because what happens there is that it follows the logic of the pleasure principle, right? We build tension and then we release tension. So in daily life, you have this dialectic of pain and then pleasure, pain and then pleasure, and the goal of life is just to manage this, in a very mediated and rational, not at the extremes, just ordinary way. And so we do that with our lives. If life gets a little too tough, we go on a little vacation and things come down. And so that's not sublimation, right? So what it means, so one thing that Freud says, it's a bizarre statement. He says that in sublimation we achieve satisfaction. So you take this psychoanalytic definition of non-sexual aims and you try to square it with this idea you get satisfaction, and it doesn't go together, because by definition, a non-sexual aim is one that doesn't achieve satisfaction. But then you look in Freud, and you can look in two places. One is early and one is late. In the early Freud, you would look in his three essays on the theory of sexuality. And in the late Freud, or just like the middle Freud, you would look at beyond the pleasure principle. And in both places, Freud talks about how there is a pleasure in the unpleasure. So in the three essays on the theory of sexuality, he talks about this thing called forepleasure. And what he means is that to have intense experiences of pleasure, we have to increase tension according to his economic model. And so we engage in different kinds of acts that increase, so for example, an easy example would be the drum roll before you're going to announce who's the winner, right? So what makes the announcement of the winner more exciting is that you do a little drum roll and everyone gets a little excited, agitated, okay? That's a form of a preparatory act, Freud talks about, and then he's talking about sex. So, we do things in sex too, like we talk to each other, we look at each other. But he also says those preparatory acts themselves are pleasurable. This is probably more easy to see in terms of sex, right? Like when you look at your soon-to-be sexual partner, you find that looking pleasurable. If you're doing the drum roll thing, you kind of find the drum roll thing kind of fun. People are kind of like, they get into it, And so what Freud says is that there is a form of pleasure that comes from this unpleasure. And that's what I really lock into, right? So where I would say you can say, at what point does this actually become sublimatory? It's not when it's incorporated into this large economy of increase and decrease, of having beers at night and bike rides and then going to work in the morning. But it's when the actual pain of the activity itself becomes a source of pleasure. So you're writing that novel and you find the struggle of what word am I trying to figure out? How does this line work? And how do I get this paragraph working? That painful activity itself becomes like a source of pleasure. Some kind of strange pleasure comes out of it. That's when you're starting to sublimate.
And so then the genius is some figure who has mastered that precise capacity or has tapped into it.
Or you might say has been mastered by that, right? So they have traded in all kinds of end pleasure, right? This goes back to Leonardo, right? He was the anti-Steve Jobs. He was taking things out of the market. He was not completing his artwork precisely because he wanted to enjoy this process of incompletion, right? This is like, no capitalist would act this way, right? You would never found the company and say, our job at this company is to get very close to inventing products that we can bring to market and then taking them out of the market. Like that company would go out of business like overnight.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, this is such an interesting argument. And, as a side point, Jacques Lacan, in his later reflections on the concept of sublimation, I don't know, I gave a presentation on this once to my Lacanian forum where I live, because, the later Lacan actually had this idea of what in French is called the escabeau. It's translated as the soapbox. And it's kind of like a theory of narcissism in which he sort of suggests that in the future, sublimation will no longer be possible. So he gives like a very pessimistic point about that, which has to do with the sort of pernicious rise of the discourse of capitalism and science and how they fuse. But it also has to do with the collapse in the way that fusion of science and capitalism harms our belief system. So it's a bit of a complicated argument, but he basically, I think, suggests that the Freudian model of sublimation is based on this kind of like exception to the social or the symbolic, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like a la Antigone, for example. Like Antigone, through the demand for the rites of the burial of her brother, points to something which is beyond the law, which is beyond the symbolic, and insists upon it. I think Lacan is saying something about the deterioration of society, or maybe or of the symbolic. I don't know if you're familiar with some of this later Lacan stuff on sublimation.
Where is this coming specifically?
This actually comes precisely from the Lacan of the parlette, of the speaking body. So this is like late seminar 21 onward, after Encore, where he's talking about this. Like, for example, in Malaire's school, Jacques-Alain Malaire, he discusses this quite a lot. I could send you some different articles that they've written about this notion of Lacan makes a joke where he says, pretty soon everyone will address their own jouissance from their soapbox. And he says that address will no longer have an address. It will no longer have an other that will be addressed to. So Malaire argues that Lacan kind of gives a kind of prophetic look at like social media.
Yeah.
Right. Where social media, like, and that actually might be a question for you, Daniel. Like, how can we think subjectivity in the internet, in the context of the internet, social media, and sublimation? Like, have you thought about that? Does that make sublimation does it force us to re-theorize it, maybe?
I think that so I don't know this particular Lacan. I mean, I've read a lot of Lacan, but I don't know this particular aspect of Lacan. I will say though that I don't agree if the suggestion is that social media today is a world without the big other. the Lacanian other with a capital O. I don't agree with that. I think actually what makes the social media so alluring for people is that it's an always available other. So like, for example, you wanna say to somebody, your green shirt is ugly, right? So I can't tell you, Daniel Tutt, this because you live on the other side of the world. So I can't just drive up to your house and tell you I hate your green shirt. And so I shout it out into my social media, and presumably someone out there, right? Someone out there receives that message, and so I think that's what's, it used to be you pray about it, God tell them that their green shirt is ugly. But in the world in which that kind of belief in the big other has collapsed, you have this always available other in the form of the social media other that you can kind of shout into a void. And because I don't really think that people believe when I type this into my thing that this person is actually going to see it. Like the way I think of this is like, so for example, Elon Musk will tweet something, and then ordinary people like me can respond to him specifically. And I imagine that he's like read my tweets, but it's not, not even his own people are reading the tweet. Right. So, but it functions as a big other for me, right? Because I can imagine that someone out there has received my witty comeback at Elon Musk. And so in a world like that, I don't think that this changes any basic coordinates. Now, there's a larger question here about the relationship of the big other to sublimation.
Yeah, please.
Right? Because pleasure, according to Freud, and you might say in terms of values, in terms of Lacan and Marx, requires some kind of recognition from the big other.
Right.
Whether it be the market, right? Or it's an actual person laying. When I was a kid, I used to collect baseball cards, and you would have this guy named Beckett who like told you how much each card was worth, right? And you subscribed to his magazine, so you knew. So you had some big other out there who was assigning value. And actually collectors these days are not really collectors, they're speculators. So like comic book collectors, they're trying to predict what comic book is going to become a key book. That's the term they use in comic book collecting. And because it'll be a first appearance of a character, for example, and then it'll skyrocket in value. And so there is this way in which value, pleasure, my sense of pleasure is all tied into the determinants of this big other. Now, if it's true that the genius is captivated by this pleasure in pain, this pleasure in unpleasure, it's something that falls out of circulation. It's something that is unreliant on the other, right? This is something that becomes very internal, because my writing is the pleasure I get from writing the novel is no longer determined by whether it picks up a publisher or it becomes a bestseller or the publisher thinks it's a good book. It actually becomes about me and this repeated failure to write the book, right? This pleasure that comes from struggling to figure out the words, to scrap a draft and restart all over again, And so I think it becomes very indifferent whether we live in some kind of, maybe what I might say is that in the future, if we ever get to the point where there is no big other, then we will all have to be confronted with this idea of taking pleasure from our unpleasure, and maybe that's just things that people don't want to do. So in that sense, genius is kind of a negative figure there. I don't think people want to be genius. It would be an implication here.
So, okay, so then that's very helpful. So it's starting to really gel for me, and I hope it is for listeners. In other words, and this will kind of lead us into the next thing I want to talk about, which is the theory of sublimation in groups. Because so it sounds like in the Lacanian view of things, Lacan had this idea that kind of modern society is eroding Freud's understanding of the unconscious.
Yeah.
And this is what he has this idea of the non-duped heir. right? Which is a kind of interesting little formula he uses, which is to say that he basically is saying that psychoanalysis, as Freud discovered it, is facing a kind of existential crisis whereby, as speaking beings, we are no longer dupes of our own speech, of our own unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very strange idea. And he also has this idea from Seminar 17, the other side of psychoanalysis, about the rise of new types of objects. You may remember this phrase of the Latou's object. Do you remember that from Seminar 17? We were recently studying it in my Lacan study group. And there have been some folks that have theorized how the emergence of like new technological objects might also change our investment in sublimation, and even like AI itself. And so I was wondering, before we talk about the theory of groups, can we stick with this a little bit longer? Because what you just said is fascinating, which is, well, if we develop a civilization in which people generally have abandoned fidelity to some big other, and that if we pick up on Lacan's idea that, well, in the future, people are no longer going to see the unconscious as a problem. Because you remember in that seminar, Lacan basically says, yeah, Freud's structure of the unconscious was one in which esoteric spiritual knowledge could be was like valid, or not valid, but like had efficacy in the cosmos of the time.
Sure.
And Lacan says that's not our future, right? But that doesn't mean that the big other necessarily diminishes. I think actually what Lacan means is the big other maybe intensifies.
Yeah.
It intensifies. I mean, the rise of conspiracy theory,
Yeah.
Paranoia in politics. I think social media just accentuates the big other. I don't see a situation, nor could I envision one, of a deterioration of the big other. I think rather it's more of the localization of big others into what Miller calls ethical communities. So there's no longer some universal guarantee of a big other, right? That would homogeneously organize cultural life or something like that. It's more like we're inducted into these sub communities that have distinct kind of big others to themselves. So now I'm kind of going into the group thing, but maybe we could tether a little bit more with this. What do you think? Let me just formulate it as a question. What do you think about AI and sublimation?
So I like how you spoke about the intensification of so this is an early Lacan, right? So in Lacan in Seminar 3, in his theory of psychosis, he says what's foreclosed in the symbolic returns in the real, right? So you don't the father who you excise from the symbolic order doesn't just go away, right? It returns in this more vicious form in the real. And I do. So what you're describing there, I see following this dynamic, right? Like, so on one hand, we do have the demise of I think it's, like Zizek and Dolar and, these, and I forget who the other person is, but the guy who talks about interpassivity, I forget what his name is.
Fowler. Yeah. Robert Fowler.
Yeah. They talk about the demise of symbolic efficacy quite a bit, right? So I think that you have that loss, but I think that the rise of right-wing populism and right-wing leaders and figures like these kind of demagogic figures like Elon Musk and things like that, it shows you that the big other itself as a general concept itself has gone away, right? We've gone away from the big other as kind of like a symbolic institution that kind of guarantees the efficacy of all kinds of behavior, right? And what we've done is we've traded that symbolic other for these real others, right? These primal father figures who are going to ensure that certain things happen a certain way. And so I think that right now in the United States, we're living in a moment where we're actively demolishing the symbolic order, literal, in a very literal term. We're ending institutions. We're destroying symbolic relationships. We're destroying symbolic institutions. And I think that it's a mistake to think that this will somehow lead to freedom. That we'll all take off our clothes and start having sex in the streets or something like that. No, it's going to turn into authoritarianism is what it's going to turn into. So what gets eradicated in the symbolic is going to return in the real.
Yeah, it's a strange, dark turn to a type of perverse, libertine, ludic enjoyment beyond all prohibitions logic. Like it's like dialectically, like it's the return of that impetus in some way that's very monstrous. Now Freud theorizes what he calls the artificial groups in group psychology, and I want to invite you to say something about sublimation and Freud's theory of groups. One thing that we've looked at a lot on my show is the very important political context in which Freud theorizes groups.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you're probably familiar with this, but it kind of comes about at a very important moment in European history, right? Right at the moment in which you have like the Spartacist uprising in Germany, which was like an attempt at a communist revolution. And Bruno Bostiels was on my program, and he made an important point that Freud had an interlocutor in his group psychology text, a figure by the name of Gustave Le Bon. And Le Bon is basically a theoretician of how to control unruly crowds, unruly masses, right? And so there is this thing what Freud calls the spontaneous group, and they are kind of like resisting capture by the artificial groups, like the church, the army, and all of that. How does sublimation fit? First, just kind of give us the big picture into Freud's theory of groups, and then from that, I want to talk about like some practical examples.
So let me take a step back and make some comments about group psychology itself, right? So the book is written, I think, in 1921, and it's like you say, it's a turning point in European history. He's writing this book at the beginnings of the Nazi movement. So in a lot of, and it's interesting because you like you mentioned, he is very critical of communism in the book, right? He's very, he sees that, or in the later texts, like in Civilization and Discontents, he sees these promises of a classless society as kind of like what we're describing about this kind of world without the big other kind of thing. But you also have to understand that Freud is making an intervention in this burgeoning study of mass psychology with Gustave Le Bon, McDougall. There's a few figures that are involved in this, and basically Le Bon, his thesis is simply that like people are dumb. It's kind of like what we say today about Trump followers. They're uneducated, and so they're easily duped. And in fact, what they are is they're mesmerized. Like mesmerism has become a thing, right? So one of the things that Freud is intervening in is this use of hypnosis and this use of intelligence as a way to explain away a very complicated psychic process, right? So Freud is trying to say, look, these people aren't just stupid. Like stop trying to say if we just give them better education, they would just stop believing in the leader. There is something libidinal going on, meaning they are getting some kind of gratification from this group relationship. And we need to get to the bottom of that if we're going to understand what's going on in the group. It's also important to note that Freud, I think that Freud already had a sense that his position in Europe was precarious, or the position of Jews in Europe were precarious. In the book itself, he makes all kinds of references to anti-Semitism and uses them examples to point out how Jews are always this displaced people who kind of attract whatever whatever negativity people want to ascribe to a group, Jews function this way in history. And so I think he's already has a sense that, look, things don't look very good for us here in Europe. And so I don't think he wants to come right out and say a lot of things out front. I think he's very aware, Austria is a Catholic nation, right? So I think he doesn't want to ruffle any feathers. And actually, the fact that he was conscious of all of this is very clear by the time we get to the 1930s, and he's writing things like Moses and Monotheism. He's explicitly telling people, I didn't want to draw the ire of the Catholic Church, right? So you can already imagine he's got this in his mind. And then another thing to think about is Freud says very clearly in the book, this is an unfinished theory. He says there's all kinds of problems with my theory. Let me point them out to you. He dedicates a whole entire chapter with problems with his own theory. And I guess people kind of like overlook that chapter because they kind of think of it as like him being falsely modest. No, I think he's telling people, look, I'm trying to make an intervention in this growing field, this emerging field of mass psychology. I'm trying to do this in a time when it's very precarious to be a Jew in Europe, with the rise of Nazism and this guy named Hitler, okay, who's just getting out of prison and things like that. And I think he's saying all of this is this is a first stab at it, and someone else is going to have to pick this work up and move forward with it. And I think a lot of Lacanians think that Lacan was one of these people who did take this very seriously because, Lacan, things are very socialized already, that the formations of the unconscious are already social. I would argue they're social in Freud too, but, there's ways that Lacanians think it's a little bit different. And so I think it's important to keep all of these things in mind in terms of how we read that text. We have to read it as an unfinished work. We have to read it as an initial intervention, and we have to read it as a work by someone who felt very endangered writing it. And on top of that, so how sublimation fits into this, there's just this vague reference that relationships that are sublimated are longer lasting. Okay. And again, what people take that to mean is that when you don't have sex with someone, you're friends for a very long time. Harry met Sally. This is like the Harry met Sally reading of group psychology. That's what people think it means, right? But if you take the thesis that I've been laying down this whole entire time, that he means something very different, right? Then that takes you to a very different place. It takes you to a place where you realize that the thing he is describing maybe doesn't actually exist. A relationship in which a group of people do not see each other as the means towards their sexual satisfaction, but see the pleasure in the thingliness of the other person. And that's the thing that they think is most valuable about that person, is the thing that cannot be incorporated, cannot be reduced to me, to my I, to my ego, right? That can be the basis of a group. And what does that look like? And I'll be honest with you, it was very hard for me to work out in the book. And I don't know if I was actually quite successful at doing it. It's something that Freud doesn't think through. He can't. He's telling us he can't do it. He's got a whole chapter telling us he can't do it. And I'm not sure, in Lacan, at least in Seminar 7, where he talks about Das Ding, it's certainly not worked out there, right? So in Seminar 7, formations of sublimation tend to be heroic individuals like Antigone, right? Not a social group.
Right.
So it becomes very difficult to think about.
Well, it's very helpful. There is a couple of things I would say on this because I've written a lot about this and it's of deep interest to me. First of all, I don't know if you are aware, but Lacan gave this lecture right after the Second World War in London, I think, to psychiatrists, to the psychiatric and psychological community involved with the British state. And it was a lecture dedicated to Wilfred Bion. Why? Because Wilfred Bion consulted the British military when they were fighting the Nazis, using his group theory to give to advice for how groups, cadres, military units can overcome impediments. And Lacan said that Wilfred Bion helped win the war because his advice was so significant. And one of the things that I think Bion teaches us in his theory of what he later develops as the mystic group, right, which is he basically says that there's never a solution available to the Oedipus complex at a group level. And so what needs to happen is that every group member needs to be aware of and then externalize their symptom into a collective problem. And he says that, I'm summarizing, right? Because he says, like, a group that can do that creates a receptacle where their own individual symptoms no longer plague them as individuals, but they've been sort of like reapplied to this receptacle. And that's what he calls like the achievement of like a mystic group, whereby, the neuroses of the group, no individual neuroses are now collectivized. Something like that. And I think that Lacan is like, wow, that is very sound. So perhaps, Daniel, perhaps, and I think this is true, Wilfred Bion, maybe he points away. Like Fred Moten has a great essay on this for how Bion's theory of the mystic group can be applied to left-wing politics. It's very worth reading. Because I think that's true. And then I think the other reference I would make would be to Leon Rosichner's interpretation of group psychology through socialist lens in his book, Freud and the Limits of Bourgeois Individualism, which is so good. Because what he thinks is the reason that Freud talked a lot about anti-Semitism and was negative about communism is not because he was truly negative about communism. It was because he had an anxiety over professional ostracization if he embraced Bolshevism. Because Bolshevism at the time was a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. Right? And he gives the receipts to show this. So he's like, because of that, you can kind of read Freud through a left-wing lens, by the way. Bolivar says the same thing in his book on the discovery of the superego, right? So let's return and ask you, because it's so important to think about what the power of a group, because what you're really talking about is a theory of identification, right? The group identifies its members in such a way that they have almost abandoned this model of bourgeois narcissism. Because remember, one of the things Freud says about artificial groups is that they keep each member in a state of infantile dependency with the director of the artificial group. And this kind of harms their potential as subjects. But I felt like what Freud doesn't give us is a positive model of a group that could transcend that. Yeah. He hints at it, but he doesn't fully elaborate it. So my question to you is like, how can we practically apply that? Maybe like, could we talk about this as like a sublimated group or like a group that, because that's actually what left-wing groups should be.
Yeah, right? I think you can even add in here Alain Badiou, right? Alain Badiou's critique of Lacan or psychoanalysis generally is that it doesn't have a positive theory of the group, right? It can only think in terms of negative terms, like away from identification. And actually, you're quite right to say that group psychology boils down to a theory of identification. Or identification and idealization. Those two terms, kind of those concepts interweave into one another. And so identification is a concept that already seems weighted towards anti-left, right? Like it seems already towards feelings of brainwashing and propaganda and things like that. So I think that you're right to say that that psychoanalysis doesn't create an easy path forward for someone who's trying to think left-wing politics in terms of group psychology. It's actually a very interesting thesis about what might have been motivating Freud to sound so anti-socialist or anti-communist. Personally, I tend to steer away from those kind of more biographical explanations, even though, you might have unearthed letters or things like that. Sure. Because my feeling is that the Freud we get, though, is the Freud of the published text. So, it kind of doesn't really matter what he's saying behind the scenes, but the challenge then becomes, how do you take the tools that Freud left us with, which are very powerful tools for theorizing these kinds of things, right? Especially, like, sure, we might be complaining that Freud and Lacan don't give enough of a positive vision of it, but we all have to admit that the tools they've given us are very powerful in terms of critiquing what the group is. And so, can we take those tools and can we formulate something that is a left-wing group? And my inclination is to say, whatever that formation is going to be, is going to involve the concept of sublimation. Because I really do find that theory, that Bionian theory of the symptom being sort of externalized, I find that to be kind of like, I kind of don't know what that means. I kind of like, it almost seems like it seems very difficult to put my mind around. But what seems more comprehensible to me, though, is that our ways of acquiring enjoyment, the ways we acquire pleasure, those might be transformed in the group, right? And I think that that's something. So maybe if there's a group formation around something, it's around those sources of pleasure, or the way we enjoy. And that's actually something, Todd McGowan talks a lot in his work, right? Is that what separates left from right is the way enjoyment is structured, not the absence or presence of it, right? And I guess I'm trying to contribute to that line of thinking, that sublimation is precisely a theory of a different kind of enjoyment. That's precisely what it is. So what does it contribute here in terms of this thinking?
So that's helpful. So you think that the externalization of individual neuroses, because I think what Bion is trying to get at is, how can a group not be inhibited in its own exchange protocols internal to the group by the persistence of idiosyncratic individual neuroses, right? So, for example, if I have a problem with, I don't know, jealousy that I have not analyzed, its persistence could, unbeknownst to us in the group, hold us down and then, block our potential from achieving certain things. Just as a side example. I think.
Can I say something about this real quick?
Please.
Oh, because you mentioned the word inhibition. This is actually crucial for understanding sublimation, because Freud describes sublimation in terms of inhibition. So what he says there is that sublimation is inhibited drive, right? Because if you think about drive as aiming towards satisfaction and the decrease of tension, and sublimation as the drive that aims towards unpleasure and the increasing, like, takes pleasure from that unpleasure, then you quickly come to the idea that the sublimated drive is also an inhibited drive. So it's kind of like, I'm sure that's not what the way Bion is using that term, but one way to think about it is actually the sublimated group for Freud would be one in which inhibition is quite operative.
Okay, so that makes sense. So, well, we don't, perhaps it's not the place to sort of get into a full compare and contrast on Bion versus your thinking, or the kind of McGowan's conception. But I suppose I just want to tether with a little bit more and ask maybe some practical examples of how group identification, if we take this notion of like, what we share is a commitment to a common object.
Mm-hmm.
It's through that commitment to the common object of the cause of our mission, let's say, that I envision as then re-channeling down to then change the inner identifications of the group, so that you as a comrade are no longer a comrade who's racked by these particular anxieties and this particular symptom and this particular problem with your childhood or whatever, right? Like those are no longer consequential to the functioning
Right.
of the group, because
Right.
is that kind of what you're advocating or thinking? Because I guess the question is, how can psychoanalysis help us achieve a type of group cohesion that is stronger and more fortified against external challenges?
Yeah.
Right?
So I think, okay, so if I were to try to wrap my brain around what I think I was trying to achieve in the last section of the book. So yeah, so one piece is what everything I just described about sublimation and groups and etc. I think and then the second piece I think is Lacan's notion of sublimation and dusting, right? So to go back to dusting, as far as I understand it, is precisely that aspect, that object in the object, right? That aspect of the object that I cannot reduce to me, that I cannot incorporate into me. And so therefore it's a challenge to me, into my own sense of identity, right? Because and you find this a lot with like liberal white people. Okay, like whenever I talk to liberal white people, I'm either I'm either like they start speaking Korean to me. I'm like, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. I'm not Korean. You're more Korean than I am, or so this feature of my identity is something they're quite uncomfortable with, the ambiguity of it, right? They want to reduce it to something they can understand, right? Like I can understand what it means to be Korean, for example. But the thing, right, that Das Ding that Lacan is talking about is precisely that thing that cannot be reduced in that way. And then I think the third touch point here for me is Todd's A Theory of Universality in the Universality book, of belonging versus not belonging. And I think that what I tried to do is try to put these three things into conversation with each other. And I do it through a reading of this film, Clooney Brown, which is about this woman, 1930s film about this woman. I think the film itself is from the 40s, but set in the 30s, of this woman who wants to be a plumber. And it's precisely this desire to be a plumber that makes her not fit within her society, right? She does not exist as a subject within her own society, or an identity, I might say, within her society. And what turns her and this other character, Adam Belinsky, who sees this enjoyment that she has that's structured around plumbing, and he doesn't try to change it or anything like that. He precisely, it sublimates it. He reduces the object of Clooney Brown to the thing of this plumbing, right? You might say, or elevates this thing to the thing of this plumbing. And what I think is happening in this film is that both of these characters, by the encounter with Clooney Brown's plumbing, her thing, they both fall out as identities into subjectivity outside of normal British society, high British society. And that falling out, and I think that in Lacan, he calls this excrementalization or something like that, right? Like something crazy with Lacan, right? We become excrement. And it's that excrementization through which we find ourselves as a group, right? So what sublimation might add to that is that in this existence outside of this non-belonging, in which we are subjects who don't belong to a normalized society, capitalist society, is that we find in that encounter some kind of enjoyment in the unpleasure, right? So in the non-actualization of our ability to find objects for a drive.
Wow, that's gorgeous. Yeah, I really think this is a thoughtful approach. And I feel like as a Marxist, it does offer a certain series of insights that, and I wonder if you have thought about that, because I know you've done a lot of work on like Marcuse, and you think about, I assume you think quite a lot about this kind of Freudo-Marxist rapprochement. Um, could I ask you to perhaps say a little bit about your thoughts regarding Freud and Marx, perhaps, and if you've thought about that? Um, does anything come to mind in that thing? Do you think that Freudian Marxism is viable? Is a sort of positive project? Do you consider yourself a Freudian Marxist?
I think so. My early formation was through the Frankfurt School. That's how I came to psychoanalysis. Actually, was through the Frankfurt School. So Walter Benjamin, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, very important figures for me in my education. And I think, though, if I were to give a critique, though, of the kind of Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse approach to it, is that it was kind of like Marx gives us category A, and then Freud gives us category B, and we just kind of weld them together. Like Marx gives us some kind of objective description of capitalist society. Freud gives us some kind of subjective psychic description of capitalist society, and we just sort of weld them together. And I think probably in my early life, I found that quite compelling. I think that as I've gotten older and studied more myself, is that the reality is much more complex. And you have in Marx already a theory of subjectivity, a theory of a psychic or a subjective experience of capital. And I think that you've got many people who work that out, right? You've got, like Zizek is one of them, right? You don't need to go to Freud to get an account of what the psychic consequences of capital are. You can work that out yourself. On the other hand, I think that in Freud, you already have a description of an objective world. It's not correct to say that Freud is locked into some kind of psychic description only. There is an account of the world as an object world in Freud already. This is why you have things like Lacan and Winnicott and Melanie Klein. These are only possible because you already have the building blocks of it in Freud already. So I think that for me, I think that there is a lot of resonance and a lot of possibility in bringing these two figures together, but it can't just be in this kind of Lego blocky. You put one and you put the other and you connect them together, because you really have to take seriously the kinds of accounts that are already embedded in each figure separately. So there's that aspect. Then you have people like Todd McGowan who are calling for Zizek, Todd McGowan, who are calling for a return to Hegel, right? Like that Marx already is a right-wing deviation from Hegel, right? So then you have to contend with this idea that each of these figures, while getting something incredibly correct, perhaps got something incredibly wrong. And for this, let me just stick to Freud, okay? That in group psychology, group psychology is one of the most important texts for me personally in terms of Freud's corpus, okay? It's in the Mount Rushmore of Freudian texts for me. And but I acknowledge that Freud gets a lot wrong in that. And actually what makes that text so fascinating to me is all the stuff he gets wrong more than he gets right. So for example, his use of the church. There's a lot of work that can be done to show that actually the church may not fit this description that you're talking about. And if it doesn't fit, is it actually a model of an alternative group? Same thing, you could say the same thing about the army, right? So for me, I think there's a lot of work to be done within Freud, right? Sort of, if I were to use a Jordan Peterson, I got to clean up my own room before I can go accuse someone else of cleaning their own room. There's a lot of work that can be done in Freud already to give an account, a more robust account, for example, of groups, of collectives, of an object world, of a trans subjectivity, right? That's not just an individual, a bourgeois psyche. That's already there waiting to be done in Freud. Now, to the question of am I a Freudo-Marxist? Um, I feel like no matter which way I answer that question, I'm going to anger some crowd. I will just say that I fully recognize I fully recognize Marx's description of capital. Like I'm fully convinced by that. I don't know if I fully accept, Todd's Hegel thesis. And I'm fully convinced by Freud's account of the psyche, and how we work that out, I think is a whole nother. So if being a Freudo-Marxist means that in my work I'm constantly trying to work that out, then I'm not a Freudo-Marxist, because I am not doing that. But in terms of if I am convinced by those separate accounts, then in that sense, yes, I am a Freudo-Marxist.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Yeah, I think that's very helpful. I mean, I suppose my response would be, okay, well, I don't want to get into it fully, but I will say I think that the Zizek and McGowan reading of Hegel is, while I find parts of it convincing, I'm also not fully convinced of it. And I think this idea that Hegel is more materialist than Marx misses something about the 19th century and the continuity of social and political struggles that connect the 19th century to our present. So I take issue with their claim at the level of kind of like historicism. I don't want to get into it, but thank you for sharing that. And
can I add something here?
Please.
I think that it's hard for me to answer questions like this, because I think for me, reading itself is an infinite process. Like, I don't think I can admit to you that I've read enough Marx to even say that I'm a Marxist, right? Like, and I've read all the works. What I'm saying though is that there's a level of reading Capital Volume 1, for example, that okay, so can I teach it to undergrads? Fine, right? I can teach it to undergrads. But can I say that I have exhausted all there is in that text? Not nearly. I could never say that. It would take me to commit my whole life, like a rabbi, okay, to studying that text by itself to even come close to saying something like that. So I really avoid definitive claims like that, because I'm not smart enough to say that I know those texts to the microscopic detail that I need to be able to label myself or to make these kind of definitive claims. So I guess that's kind of a wimpy answer, but I guess, I've chosen at some point to really focus on Freud, and I feel like I can say some things about Freud that are educated, that are not just like wild claims. And I think that so I guess I would say, like, the reading process itself, studying itself, is so infinite. I'm not sure I feel comfortable making kind of claims like that.
No, that I think is more valid for Freud than it is for Marx, in the sense that Marxism has a long tradition as a active corrective to socialism itself, or as a kind of like Marx and Engels as a as a method for the realization of socialism is what I take Marxism to be about. Psychoanalysis, I think I take to be about the method of the talking cure itself, and I take it to be, I think, in the context of politics, actually quite a peculiar institution, which sort of is ultimately a lesson for Marxists or socialists or the left about subjectivity. So I take psychoanalysis to be sort of like this very robust system that is also, in a complicated way, and I get this from Elaine Badiou, itself a kind of anti-philosophy. I really do think that psychoanalysis situates itself in distinction to philosophy, which is a whole other topic we could discuss. But I'm not sure that I agree with you that we need to define our commitment to these worldviews and these theoretical systems based on hermeneutic specialization. I'm not saying you're saying that, but like that would kind of take us back to the problem of them being exclusionary discourses, when I don't think that they're meant to be exclusionary.
Sure.
Because nobody who would have the time to do that. I mean, I certainly think that they are each discourses that necessitate a life's work of investment into them, and that's for sure. You know what I mean? Like they're kind of infinite sources for some kind of revolutionary knowledge. Anyways, are you working on any other projects right now at the moment?
Yeah, so I'm working on a number of things. I have a few essays that are, I'm working on group psychology. So I have a couple of essays that are out by that. I'm working on a special issue of the journal Psychoanalysis, Culture, and Society with my friend Bosch-John Nadeau on group psychology. So there's that. I'm also working on building on some work that I had done on Freud and Moses and monotheism on psychoanalysis and religion. And that work is mostly a staging of a confrontation between Freud and Carl Schmitt. So it's about political theology, and so it's about what a Freudian political theology looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the book that I'm working on right now. And so yeah, those are kind of the things that are taking up my attention right now.
Well, Daniel, thanks for coming on Emancipations podcast. We really enjoyed it, and love to talk to you in the future. I just gave a presentation on Freud's Moses and Islam because I have done a fair amount of study into Islam and psychoanalysis with a new group called Psychoanalysis Pakistan. So yeah, that is of great interest. And there's a new book, by the way, that just came out by Ronald Biener and Harrison Fluss that might interest you on kind of the political theology of Moses. It's like sort of a survey of all of these different readings of Moses from 20th century theoreticians. I don't know if you're aware of that book.
I'm not. So thank you for putting it on my radar.
Yeah, I'll share it with you. Okay, cool. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Well, thank you.
Hang tight. But thanks, everybody.